Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started here. I would like to thank you all for joining us. My name is Stuart Spencer, and I'm the Executive Director for the Lodi Winegrape Commission. I'm going to be wearing several hats today, and my first one is as the Executive Director of this great organization we have here in Lodi. And I want to thank you for joining us, everyone that's out there for this Lodi Wine Masterclass. And I want to thank my fellow growers and vintners, Tegan, Jeff, and David, for joining us and taking time out of harvest, which is still busy for everyone, I'm sure, to be here as well. And most of all, I'd like to also thank Elaine Brown and the SommFoundation for helping make this all possible. Just as a quick introduction to Elaine, and then I'm going to hand it off to her because she's a true expert in this. We conceived of this series of masterclasses probably about 2 years ago. And when we started discussing it internally, I couldn't think of a better person to host this than Elaine. Elaine has, I think her first visit to Lodi was probably about 2012. And she has dove into this wine community much more so than anyone I've ever hosted or experienced here in Lodi. And she really does her best to understand the place and the people that make Lodi special. And so it was with that we offered and asked Elaine if she'd be willing to do this, and she gladly accepted. And then she spent another couple of weeks doing additional research in the area to make sure she fully understood what we were going to be discussing and talking about. And we launched these classes last January or February. We did one in person in Washington, D.C., and then we headed off to Houston and then finished up in Denver in early March before all craziness ensued. And it does feel like that was a lifetime ago, but we're all still here. We're still growing grapes and the wine is still being made. And we are delighted to have Elaine and all of you joining us to learn a little bit about Lodi. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Elaine and take it away.
Thank you so much, Stuart. It's great to be here. I have a lot of love for Lodi and I'm really grateful to have been welcomed into the community so many times. There's a lot of really special people there, and we're going to talk about some of those special people over the next couple days. Today, we're going to really focus in on discussions of the great history of Lodi and its work with Zinfandel and a couple of other historic varieties. We'll talk a little bit about the growing conditions in the AVAs in general, but we'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow when we do our second session. So I want to be sure and remind everyone watching today that we do also have a second session tomorrow where we'll really dig into the different AVAs and some of the really exciting other varieties being grown. But today is really quite special because we're looking at the varieties that really make up what I think of as the heart of California wine and the real deep history of California wine. Lodi has played a crucially important role in the history and success of California wine. And the truth is that some of the time it hasn't been talked about and it hasn't been focused on in that kind of way. But it has actually played a part in many of California's greatest wines, many of California's most famous wines. And I sometimes joke that in that sense, Lodi really makes up the backbone of California wine, but most people don't stand there and turn around looking at their own spine. So it plays a really crucial role in kind of helping to stand up the history and heart of California. And we're going to spend 2 days talking about it and actually looking at it more. So today, some of us do actually have a host of wines to taste through as we go, but we're going to talk about those wines in a way that helps elucidate more about Lodi in general. So even if you don't have them with you, that hopefully the discussion will still illuminate a lot for you. The important thing to remember is I will, as I can, keep an eye on the chat, but when I'm tracking so many people on screen, it can be hard to follow the chat. So if you do have specific questions for us panelists, please use the Q&A box that's there at the bottom of your screen and go ahead and direct actual specific questions for the panel in the Q&A box. And then things that you want to talk about with each other, the people attending and watching the webinar, you can put into chat. And that way I can definitely track the Q&A box. Zoom does a nice job of holding on to those questions and keeping them at the top so I can still see them, whereas the chat tends to fly right by. We have a fantastic panel today. Stuart Spencer, you just met, and we're going to hear more from him later too, as he gets to talk about his winery St.Amant and one of the wines that he makes there, and plays an important role historically in the region as well, and in California more broadly. David Akiyoshi, it's an honor to have you here. You've played a really important role in the history of Lodi wine as well, and today are speaking in relation to LangeTwins, which has done incredible work with restoration and sustainability efforts there in Lodi. So we'll hear more about that. And Jeff Perlegos, I'm so happy to see you here. Jeff and I met accidentally years ago. He just happened to be visiting Lodi and was kind of walking through a neighborhood where I was hanging out. And we just happened to recognize each other and got to speak, and then quickly made efforts to go visit vineyards in Lodi. And so it'll be really fun to hear about.
Sonoma.
In Sonoma, yes,
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, we bumped into each other in Sonoma, and that led to us going to spend time together in his vineyards there in Lodi, which was really fun. And then Tegan Passalacqua, of course, here speaking about Turley wines and his work with Turley for quite a good long time now there in Lodi, but he of course also has his own Kirschenmann vineyard in Lodi, and we're going to get to hear about both Turley and Kirschenmann today. And then Jay Fletcher, I'm so grateful for you joining us from SommFoundation. And Jay is going to, Jay does have each of the wines, and so we're going to get to hear his thoughts on the wines as we go as well. Okay, Stuart, did I forget anything?
I think you're good to roll. So
okay, great. Okay, so Kayla is helping us behind the scenes, and she's going to be pulling up maps and photos and wine slides as we go. So we're going to take a couple of minutes just to get us situated, to look at where we're located in California. Where are we looking at? So Lodi's done a nice job of creating this very straightforward map to help you see where in California we are. You can see there X marks the spot. Lodi is in what we would call I would call the entrance to the Central Valley. And we're going to talk about that more in a second. But you can see it's pretty directly east of the San Francisco Bay Area. And as we move into, and for me, I live in town of Sonoma, and it's about an hour and 20 minutes or an hour and a half driving, depending on traffic, and probably half an hour at the most from Sacramento there. But if we zoom in, you can see, importantly, why I say it's in the entrance to the Central Valley. So if we go to the second map, Kayla, actually, excuse me, the third map. This map is really nicely situated because, again, you can see it's just a little bit east of the San Francisco Bay. But the part of why that matters is because San Francisco Bay is actually part of a large bay complex. And you can see to the north, there's San Pablo Bay, and then there's another bulb of a bay going east. And that all connects to what we call the Sacramento River, San Joaquin River Delta complex. So those are the two biggest rivers in the state of California. They come out of the Sierra foothills and they intersect in at the entrance to the bay and create this massive delta complex. You can see some of it there. It's sort of looks almost like veins and arteries in the land there. And this is really important for two reasons. The Delta complex actually creates a deep sea port in inland California. So Sacramento, even though it's all the way inland in the Central Valley, it actually includes a deep sea port. And so large ships are able to travel in through the San Francisco Bay complex up the river and actually to Sacramento and bring various shipped goods that way, which is quite remarkable. But the reason that this matters is we know water plays a profound moderating influence in temperatures. And the other reason this matters is that the San Francisco Bay complex creates an opening in the coastal mountain range. So California is defined on both sides by a massive bank or wall of mountains. On the inland side, all the way east, there's the Sierra foothills, which are an enormous tall complex of mountains and actually shield us from the extremely high temperatures going inland and the extreme weather of high mountains as well. So the Sierra foothills in the east create a kind of weather shield from more extreme continental weather. But on the west, California is also shielded from the Pacific Ocean by the coastal mountains. The coastal mountains form a bank or wall of mountains that goes all the way from Canada down the coast of Washington, Oregon, the entire length of California, through Central America and to the very southernmost tip of South America. So it's actually a continuous mountain range north to South America. But the San Francisco Bay Complex very importantly creates an opening in those coastal mountains. The reason that matters is because off the coast of California is one of the coldest ocean currents in the world, the California current, or some of us from up north like to call it the Alaska current. But it is actually one of the coldest ocean currents in the world. And the reason this matters is because as temperatures rise in inland California, in the Central Valley, temperatures rise, and we know literally heat rises. And as temperatures rise in the Central Valley, it creates an empty space that acts like a vacuum needing to fill that empty space. So temperatures rise over the course of the day. And where are they going to get new air to fill in that empty space? It actually pulls across the Delta Bay complex, the San Francisco Bay and Delta complex, pulls actual cold air off the Pacific Ocean, rushes it over the Delta region and straight into Lodi. And that's part of why I emphasize that Lodi is at the entrance to the Central Valley, because it being uniquely situated there at the entrance, right alongside the Delta, means that it is cooled every day by Delta breezes. And so while much of the Central Valley is actually quite warm, Lodi is cooled by the Delta breezes and has quite moderate temperatures in comparison. The temperatures in Lodi are more comparable to something like mid Napa Valley, perhaps Oakville area. And Tegan and I have actually spent a lot of time driving around this area. And Tegan actually calls this Delta area that almost like the diaphragm or the lungs of California. It's as if this is a big breathing complex where air flows in and out every day, creating the incredible Delta breezes through Lodi. Tegan, do you want to add anything else to that description? You're someone that's helped me think through that so beautifully. Oops, you got muted again.
I said, not really. I think you described it really well. Yeah, I mean, I think when you're out there, it feels that way, but also looking at it visually, it's hard not to believe that it's the respiratory system of California.
Yeah, just even that imagery of the Delta, all the kind of veins going
For
through,
sure.
it really, you can really feel it out there though. And the other important piece here is that there's also nightly fog, and that plays a really important cooling influence. And that area, because of the Delta, the fog is actually an intersection of tule fog from the inland area formed on land and some maritime fog formed off the bay in the Delta. David, you've been there working with these vineyards for such a long time. I wonder if there's anything else you would like to add about this kind of cooling system that we're talking about. But you are muted right now, so you need to unmute yourself first. Oops, Kayla can maybe help you unmute yourself too. Oops.
The only thing I was going to add is it does, you know, I use the imagery as well as a swamp cooler, if people are familiar on how a swamp cooler works. The Delta actually is that water mass that you're pulling cold air over that cold water mass like a swamp cooler.
Yeah, and so it works as a really profound cooling system. David, is there anything you want to add to that kind of weather pattern that we're talking about?
No, I think, yeah, just a couple things. You know, it is one of the most unique features of our climate. And I thank you for bringing that up too, because all too often we were lumped in with the Central Valley as far as, you know, a very large grape growing area with very little definition. And yet this is something that truly defines our Lodi region in a way that a lot of other regions have capitalized on it and really helped define the region that does as well. And just to bring up another kind of couple real points that kind of bring that home. One is that at nighttime, our temperatures are very close to the nighttime temperatures of San Francisco, within a couple of degrees. And the other one is just to give you an idea of the strength of the breeze, the Delta breeze that comes through, the number of 1 megawatt windmills that are located right in the strategic area by the Delta. And that brings that breeze across. They're also generating a significant amount of electricity. They don't put them there because it's a light breeze.
Right.
Put them there because it's constant.
It's a constant breeze, yeah.
Yeah,
thank you for that. Yeah, and so if, Kayla, if we could pull up the AVA map of Lodi, we'll look at that briefly, and then we'll start actually talking through wines themselves. Yeah, so if we zoom in further, you can see there on the left, again, that Delta complex still is visible there, and you can see that the rivers actually move right through Lodi, the broader Lodi AVA. Sacramento there is in the north, Stockton is in the south in this particular map. And I mentioned that Sacramento has a deep sea port, but it's important to note that Stockton actually has a deep sea port as well. And so right there in the Central Valley, even though it's clearly inland, there's actually 2 deep sea ports. And the reason to emphasize that is in order to really get across how powerful the San Joaquin and the Sacramento rivers really are, and that they actually frame the Lodi growing region north and south. And so again, we know water has a moderating influence, but we also know that this river delta bay complex creates this incredible weather system that is not just a slight breeze, but a steady breeze, a strong wind, as David was saying. So if we look at this particular map, or sorry, Kayla, I wanted to comment on a couple other things there on the map. You can see that, so this is the larger system there, that's Lodi AVA as a whole. And within Lodi AVA, there are 7 additional nested AVAs. The nested AVAs that we're going to mainly talk about today are McCollum River, there in the kind of central south, and then Clements Hills just east of it, still in the south. Part of what I want to point out though too is just to the left of McCollum River, the blue nested AVA mentioned there, there's a gray area that's still part of the Lodi AVA, but is actually properly situated in the Delta itself. And now tomorrow, we're going to talk more about these other AVAs and actually look at some wines that come from them as well. Today, we'll just look at McCollum River and Clements Hills. The reason is because that's really the historical founding area of Lodi and really the historical center of Zinfandel as well in the McCollum River and Clements Hills. But these other growing regions, the nested AVAs, have more specific fine-tuned soil types, temperatures, and elevations. And to just give a brief overview sense, the Delta area is actually below sea level. There's much higher clay content in the soils, and clay actually absorbs cool air and cool temperatures and is a much colder soil generally as a result. So the coolest growing area is there in the Delta, that gray area, the western parts of McCollum River, Cosumnes River to the north, and western Jayhant as well. So those are all the kind of the coolest, lowest elevation areas of Lodi. And the elevations climb as you go northeast. So the highest elevation areas are in Slough House there in the northeast, the purple AVA, and also parts of Borden Ranch. The soils change profoundly as well, but we'll talk about that more tomorrow. So that just gives us a sense of where we're looking today. But we're actually going to spend time now today talking about especially Zinfandel, but also some of the historic varieties. And again, focusing mainly on McCollum River and Clements Hills. So Jeff, I would love to start with you. We actually, the first wine that we're going to talk through, and again, we're going to use it as a kind of touchstone for larger conversation, But the first wine that we're going to talk through today is Fields Family. So Fields Family is the winery, but Jeff Perlegos and his brother are actually the growers. And so we're starting with Stampede Vineyard with Jeff. But Jeff, one of the important aspects of Lodi Zinfandel is this notion of an east side versus a west side. Could you tell us what that means?
Yeah, there is this notion of west side fruit, west side of Lodi, meaning Mokelumne River, AVA, having profoundly different flavor profiles and aromas than Zinfandel grown on the east side. Actually, I should say east side is bifurcated. East side, west side is bifurcated by the Highway 99, I believe, is kind of the official designation. So east side of 99 would be considered east side Lodi, and west side of 99, of course, west side Lodi. I think typically the way it's described to be by those with much finer palates than myself. West side fruit tends to be more fruit focused, more plush in the fruity areas, and east side tends to be a little bit more structured, a little bit more has a little bit more tannic, maybe a little bit more acid, if you will, and just have a finer structure.
And we also have some soil imagery that we've compiled in order to kind of look at some of the contrasts too. So there's an interesting contrast in what we would call east side versus west side based on the wines themselves, but actually there's subtle differences in the growing conditions. And so Kayla, if we could pull up the photos. So Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about how do the soils tend to show up there in Clements Hills?
Yeah, so Clements Hills, I think the soils are about, the typical Clements Hills soils are about 250,000 years old. I think they are volcanic in nature, really defined by clay and rocks. So lots of red, lots of reddish brown, yellowish red, lots of basically red rocky soil, very clay. They may be not as deep as you would find in in Lodi proper or in Mokelumne River AVA, which is defined by sand quite a bit. But Clements Hills, really, it's about red, clay, rocky soils, usually shallower in nature. Although there is a swath of much sandier soils that you can find that kind of hug the Mokelumne River, which is the case in our vineyard as well. Our vineyard tends to be a little bit atypical of the AVA, but in general, the Clements Hills is defined by rocks.
Well, and so you also have another vineyard that's in Mokelumne River, and if we could go forward to see an image of the soil types there. So could you tell us a little bit more about how does your other vineyard in Mokelumne River differ, and how do the soils differ between the two?
Yeah, well, we actually have two other ones, one actually on the east side of Lodi and one on the west side of Lodi, both in the Mokelumne River AVA. I mean, those are profoundly influenced by sand. There's, of course, there's some pockets in both vineyards where it's just pure sand. It's Tokay fine sandy loam, but there is quite a bit of variation even within, each complex as well. But much harder to walk through when it's summertime and the soils are dry. But a lot of either pure sand or very, very sandy loam soil. So soils drain really well in both of the vineyards, but especially on my west side vineyard, the east side's got a little bit more of a loamy profile, but they're quite sandy and they drain really well.
One of my first visits to Lodi, I was actually, as silly as it sounds, I was really excited because it was right in the heart of summer. And so there hadn't been rain. Conditions were dry and it was warm, but the soil actually was still cool because it's this lighter color of sand. And sometimes sand will get incredibly hot in sunny conditions, but the soil was actually incredibly cool. And so I was wearing sandals and I went running into a vineyard and actually immediately fell on my face because the sand was so powdery soft that it actually went halfway up my leg and I tripped because I hadn't expected that. But when I fell, I was like falling into feathers. It just poofed around me, and like I was covered head to toe in sand the rest of the day. But it's just a story that helps illustrate how kind of powdery soft that soil can be in some places.
Can I add a story to that?
Please, yes.
So I don't know if, I think it was about 5 years ago, there was a pretty famous skydiving airport in Lodi. And there was a famous story where someone's parachute didn't open and they survived, and they accredit it to it that the farmer had just dissed his vineyard, and the person landed in between the vine rows, and that he had just dissed the vineyard. You know, they accredited that to saving his life. So I always like that story.
And I think he pretty much walked away from that incident, and how he avoided not, landing on a vine is a miracle.
Yeah. So I don't recommend repeating that experiment, but thank God it worked so well that time. So, but Jeff, I think it's important to share a little bit of your family story as well. And we actually have a photo of you and your brother that my daughter took, just so that we can mention him briefly. But tell us a little bit about just the farming history of your family.
Yeah. So, both of my parents are immigrants from Greece, actually. And so, when my father came to this country, he was, educated in Greece, but didn't know any English, basically. And so when he came, he actually began by finding work in vineyards and in farming. Really, he lived the American dream, was able to, pick himself up off of that and grow, and started a small business. And then when he could, bought our homestead and vineyard at the time. So really my farming, history goes back many generations, but in Lodi, just one previous generation, which is my parents. So really, as far as owning vineyards, it's really been since the late 1960s that my family's been involved in Lodi grape region. But basically, my brother and I, we grew up on a vineyard, on a Tokay and Zinfandel vineyard it's right along Highway 99. I guess it'd be considered the west side of Lodi, but really it's East Lodi. And we've had a harvest every year of our lives since then. And, farming to us back then, growing up wasn't like the funnest thing in the world to do, to be out in the heat every day and dirty and all that. And we did enjoy growing up in the country, but, we kind of went to school to maybe do something else other than farming. But I think as soon as we started along those career paths, I think the farms kind of, kept calling to us. We always were here on weekends to do what we felt was our share, or our part in that family business. And we've continued to cultivate that and do that, to this day. And so now I live back in town. I moved back a couple years ago, so I'm able to be in the vineyards every day. We farm about 50 acres of grapes and about 8 acres of cherries as well.
Well, and so I just think that story, it's such a nice example of the history of Lodi. In my mind, in wine, we spend a lot of time talking about winemakers, and winemakers have a crucially important role that does deserve to be celebrated. But the truth is, winemakers are able to do their job because growers first do theirs. And Lodi really is importantly and beautifully defined by a history of family growers that we'll keep talking about more as we move through the wines. But it's also importantly and interestingly defined by a unique history of immigration from multiple parts of the world. There are growers and grower families that originate from literally all over the world that have come together and created a really rich community in Lodi. And so your story, Jeff, is just one lovely example. But Jay, let's go ahead and look at the Fields family wine. So it's from Stampede Vineyard. Again, that is located in the Clements Hills AVA. And so this is what we're doing today is we're first looking through a series of 4 Zinfandels, and we chose 4 Zinfandels that we feel shows kind of a regional range from different parts of Lodi, and also an honest look at the range of Zinfandel and its expressions in Lodi as well. So again, Fields family is coming from the Clements Hills AVA. So it would be considered an East Side Zinfandel. It is farmed by the Perlegos family, and the vineyard was originally planted in the 1920s. So this is an old vine, head-trained vineyard. But Jay, just, first impressions as you smell and taste this wine, what is it that stands out to you?
This is a really, really pretty wine. And, on the nose, it has, red fruit, raspberry, red cherry, strawberry, but also has tones of black cherry and black plum in there as well. I get a little bit of peach, a floral peach flower kind of thing going on here. I think the oak is really integrated on this wine. There's a touch of caramelization and baking spices here, but really, really well integrated. I'm guessing, I don't have the text sheet on here, but I'm thinking this is French oak and probably, partly used, but some new barrel in there because it's not really over the top. The alcohol is really also integrated for 14.5 or whatever. It's not out of balance at all. The acidity is just medium plus. The tannins are just medium, but really silky and fine grained. And this wine just has a really pretty, beautiful balance of elegant red fruit and integrated oak. And I'm really loving this wine. I think it's excellent.
I love how bright it is. Like you were saying, there's good acidity here. It's not by any means overpowering, but it's so pleasantly bright in the mouth. And then that kind of nice, bright, pure fruit, but then it does come down into those kind of, even a little bit of savoriness and a little bit of caramelization that you mentioned, but it gives just nice depth and grounding and range to the wine in a really pleasing way, I think.
It's really well balanced, and I think the finish is extremely long on this wine. And sometimes Zinfandel can be a little hot, and sometimes it can be because the berries ripen unevenly in the clusters. We can get some green tones with Zinfandel, but to me, this one doesn't have really any green in it at all. Like maybe a little bit of fresh herb on the back end of it, but really well balanced and really pretty and really well made. I'm big.
One of the things that's really important here that we'll keep talking about too is just that, farming plays a really important role in wine in general, but in Zinfandel, especially the kind of balance you can find in the wine itself really also plays into the balance that's coming from the farming. So in terms of winemaking choices, this wine does have 25% new oak. It is French oak. So just a little bit, as Jay mentioned, but there's also about 20% whole cluster included here. And Tegan, I was hoping you could briefly comment on how you see whole cluster show up in a variety like Zinfandel. You've been able to play with destemmed and whole cluster across a lot of different varieties, but could you comment briefly on how does it show up with something like Zinfandel?
Well, I would say that I've had a number of friends that have been very successful. When we tried it at Turley years ago, to me, the wines came across more as Fernet than Zinfandel. I don't know if it was the ripeness of the grapes we used. The reason we were using whole cluster with the Zinfandel back then was that the pHs were so low. They were in the 3.1 range when we harvested them at 27 bricks. So we were trying to buffer the wine and raise the pH with the whole cluster. And the wine to me kind of tasted more like Fernet. There have been a number of people. I sell some grapes to the Arnott Roberts boys, and they do 100% whole cluster. I pleaded with them not to do it, but they really pulled it off. And I think the one thing when you work with whole cluster is that you kind of need to have your kid gloves on when you're going for extraction. So you're going to make a more elegant wine. When you destem and you have very ripe fruit, you can kind of extract as much as you want. But when you know that you have green bits in there of the stem, right, you want to kind of be a little more gentle with the extraction, not to extract as much of that greenness. And I think it shows in the wines that people use whole cluster. I think they intentionally pull back on extraction, knowing that they have some green bits.
Jay, when you were describing the wine, nothing in your description stood out to me as alluding to whole cluster. Do you have any additional thoughts, though, that you'd like to add now that we've talked about that a little bit?
No, I don't really get any of the whole cluster smells that you typically get. There's a pretty high tone kind of peachy thing, but not really any banana kind of things going on here. I think but there is a minerality that comes through on this wine that I didn't mention. There's that, sandy kind of rocky thing in there that's highlighted. It's, the kind of ozone kind of rocky smell here that really highlights this wine as well, and also puts it right, with everything else into a beautifully balanced package.
Well, and the other thing I'd like to really highlight that you mentioned too is just that silkiness of the tannin. In my mind, Zinfandels and we'll see how it continues through the next three, but Zinfandels from Lodi and that kind of sandier soil, it's almost like melting tannin. So the tannin comes in and then sort of melts and spreads across the palate. So you still have this lovely presentation of structure, but in a really silky, approachable, again, melting or palate spreading sort of way that I find pleasant.
The one thing I would mention, I do a decent amount of whole cluster for some of my personal wines. And what I've noticed is in older vineyards, you see less of that whole clusteriness, usually due to a smaller pH shift. I think a lot of what we attribute to whole cluster in a lot of New World wines is that they're younger vines and the pH jumps up 0.2 or 0.3 due to whole cluster. I've never seen that jump in older vineyards. They seem to be more stable, and you don't see that potassium push in older vineyards. I know some people in the Rhone Valley that I've worked for the first 5 to 10 years of young vines, they don't do whole cluster. They wait till the vines get a little more mature to do whole cluster. And I think they've mentioned that they see bigger shifts in the wine when the vines are younger.
Yeah, I'll second that. Just from the wine growing side, we do work with a few other smaller wineries that do whole cluster. Maitre Duché does a partial whole cluster. Craig Harmeyer does, I think, 100% whole cluster with Stampede fruit. And I'll just reiterate what Tegan said about potassium. Our potassium levels we're very mindful of them throughout the growing season. But in general, the vineyard doesn't really take up a lot of potassium. We have a pretty low pH to begin with, which is why it's a good candidate and why a lot of the small whole cluster type of folks interested in that kind of fermentation, kind of gravitate to our vineyard a little bit. But there's a lot of good examples from the vineyard that implement whole cluster, and just because of that, we don't get that pH shift. We have a low pH to start with, and then the lack of potassium really ameliorates the pH shift.
That's great. Thank you. It's another, we're going to keep talking about the value of old vines. And I know Lodi has a new initiative around that we'll talk about in a few minutes too, but it's another great example of the value of whole vines and why old vine Zinfandel could be so lovely. But Jay, as a last comment on this Fields family, do you have any thoughts about how you would want to use this wine at the table?
Oh, I think this wine would go with a lot of foods. I'd probably go to, grilled things. I think it'd be great with barbecue, like brisket. I think it'd be really good with quail and or pheasant. It's so well balanced. There's not a lot of jammy in this. With some of the Zinfandels, they can be almost baked and have like these baked fruit tones, but this doesn't. Everything's ripe and elegant. So I think I go to red meat here mainly with this wine, but also grilled food is going to be perfect. Grilled vegetables, grilled chicken, I think would be excellent with this wine. Just a little bit of smoke to go with it. It'd be beautiful.
Great, thank you. So let's keep talking about Zinfandel from Lodi, and we started further east in Clements Hills, and now we're coming into what I think of really as a central Lodi expression. We'll keep talking about east side, west side. But Marian's vineyard from St.Amant really is, in my mind, kind of a classic integration of the two, sort of a center of Lodi Zinfandel expression. And Marian's vineyard, many people locally also call the mother block, that it's really is sort of classic Lodi Zinfandel, historically important. And so, Stuart, could you tell us more about the vineyard and its history?
Certainly. So Marian's Vineyard sits at Morfry Ranches at their West Lane Ranch, just south of Lodi. This particular block is 8.3 acres of own-rooted vines planted in 1901. They've got about 90 acres of own-rooted vines at that ranch. spread out over about 7 or 8 blocks. And this one is the oldest. The rest of them were planted like in the early 40s. And we've been working with it for 20 plus years, since the late 90s. And I think it is very much a classic vineyard, a classic Lodi Zinfandel. And it consistently ripens its fruit. It consistently produces, about 2 to 3.5 ton per acre, and makes really delicious wine.
Well, and so we've talked a little bit about this notion of East Side and West Side expressions. And like I was saying, in my mind, your Marian's Vineyard kind of presents the two like a center line of the two. But could you say more about what you believe that means? Like how do we understand East Side Zin versus West Side, and why would this wine represent a kind of integration of the two?
Yeah, so in my mind, the East Side Zins tend to have more of a red fruit character to them, and the West Side kind of has some of these darker fruit characters to it. And I think this vineyard tends to blend a little bit of both of those qualities there. It also, I think some of the West Side Zins can get very big easily, and fat and fruity and just unctuous. And I think this can at times have elements of that, but it also has this kind of structure and balance you can get from the East Side too. And I think some of that is attributed to the farming practices too, and how it's managed, and then also stylistically how we go after the wine itself. Right.
So David, you've been able to work with vineyards all over Lodi, and so do you want to comment further on this notion of East Side, West Side, and how the two show up in Zinfandel?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of the McCollum River Zinfandels will present one too. Very similar comments in that respect. I do like this, the richness of the fruit that you get as you head more to the west. And I do like more of these spicy, natural kind of components that you get from the McCollum River areas.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so again, just as a reminder, as you move west, you're getting closer to that water complex we've talked about. And so you tend to have a little bit loamier soil, a little bit more clay content. And that means the soils tend to be a little bit cooler as well. But you're also, the further west you go, the more directly in line with the impact of those delta breezes or the daily winds that you are. So it's both literally a little bit cooler in temperature, but the soils can be a little cooler, and there is often a little bit more clay content as well. So Stuart, the Moorfry Ranch, it plays a really historically important role, and it's a different sort of grower family story than what Jeff was talking about with his. So could you tell us more about their family story?
Yeah, so they're Jerry and Bruce Fry are the father and son that manage the ranch today, and they actually family's been farming since the 1850s here in California, and but moved to the Lodi in the early 60s. They had property in the Bay Area, which is now clearly developed into other things, and so they moved out here, and this was a ranch they bought from a Mettler family, and there's lots of Mettlers that run around Lodi, and there's 3 brothers that own this ranch, and it was a pretty interesting ranch when they purchased it, because they had blocks of old Zinfandels, they had Palominos, they had flame Tokais, and they had cherries, and it was broken up into all these small, like 5 to 10 acre blocks on the ranch. And the interesting thing, with Jerry and Bruce is they're very much farmers first, and they're always kind of innovating in their farming operation. And we started working back in '96, and at that time my father had a vineyard, and we had a vineyard that was actually dying of phylloxera, and when you're a winery and your vineyard dies of phylloxera, it kind of leaves you in a bit of a predicament. And so we started looking at grapes in Lodi, and Jerry Fry was one of those people that came forth. And my dad created this deal. If a grower brought us 2 tons of grapes, we would make the wine, give them 25 cases so they could actually taste their vineyard, and we keep the rest. And we got some good stuff and some not so good stuff. And one day Jerry showed up with 7 tons of grapes, basically finished out this one block of 1944 old vine Zins. And my dad was super stressed about it because he didn't have the money to pay for it. And he didn't know what he was going to do with it. But Jerry was just like, don't worry about it. We'll figure it all out when it's all said and done. And ended up making great wine, won a bunch of awards, and went from being something that was a couple hundred cases. Now we make anywhere from 2,500 to 3,000 cases of it a year. And we still don't have a written contract. We still just do everything word of mouth and handshake deal. And it works really well. And I think it kind of epitomizes what we need here with Lodi and these old vineyards. And Zin is that partnership between the growers that have these vineyards and the wineries that can really kind of take them and make something out of them. And that's one of those things we're trying to foster here. And this, I think, is a perfect example of that grower-vintner partnership that leads to good wine.
Yes, it's such an example of the kind of community that you have there in Lodi. It's very much about relationships and fostering connections and caring for each other. But just to clarify, you actually make multiple Zinfandels from Morfroy Ranch. So this is a very specific block,
Yes.
This Marian's Vineyard. So could you just clarify how you're working with different blocks and what the Marian's is versus those others?
Yeah, so earlier I was saying that there's probably about 7 or 8 old Zinfandel blocks at this ranch, and we usually source from about 3 to 4 of them every year. The Marian's is 8.3 acres of own-rooted Zin, and we actually end up making 4 wines out of all these Zinfandels. We do one that's kind of a ranch designation. We do one that is a Marian's Vineyard designation, but I call it our more commercial version because it does have some new oak. And the one we included in this tasting is our Lodi native version, which is basically kind of our hands-off approach to the vineyard in that there's no new oak, there's no additives, there's no kind of anything. The only thing we use is SO2 and try to get a true kind of expression of the vineyard site. And then the 4th one we make is kind of a Zinfandel-based kind of red blend with Petit Syrah, Alicante, Boucher, and stuff like that in it.
Well, so something you alluded to but didn't quite emphasize, so I'll go ahead and emphasize it for you. One of the most important points or jobs of the moderator is actually to brag about people because they can't brag about themselves. And so Stuart, your dad had a really important role there in Lodi, and you alluded to the kind of setup that you made with some growers there after your own family vineyard struggled. But in actuality, your dad kind of offered a lot of local Zinfandel growers the first opportunity to taste their own wine from their own vineyard. So could you tell us a little bit more about that? Yeah,
I think, I want to give credit to David in his days at Mondavi, because they did run a program for many years where they allowed the growers to taste their own vineyards and kept the lots separate, which I think was a key element in transition from grape growing to wine growing. But my dad kind of took it kind of at a more micro level in that, we worked with a number of different growers early on to make single vineyard wines to let them really see what they could do. And I think, when you can actually taste the wine, it makes what you're doing out in the field much more meaningful, and they can follow through with the practices that were in the vineyard into the finished wine, which they weren't having that opportunity before. I think, one of the broader contexts here we need to understand is Lodi, even though it's a very historic wine growing region, going back, to the 1850s, there's still, the kind of fine wine, small production, vineyard specific part of it is really in its infancy in the last 20 years. And so I think my dad was one of the first that came along and started making wines like that and showing others that it could be done. And it's taken off since then. And so I think that was a key role he played early on with a lot of growers.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about, David's work with Mondavi prior to LangeTwins a little bit more in a second, but I think that's a really important point to emphasize, that the work that David, you were doing there and Mondavi was doing was very much about helping growers make the connection from the vineyard to the wine itself. And those tastings are such an important aspect of that. And then Stuart, you know, the work that your father was doing was sort of like, and now here you can keep the bottle and see that you can make your own wine too. And so it's a nice kind of historical evolution of progress of linking growers to vineyards. And so David, I'm excited to hear more from you about that in just a minute, if just so we can manage time right now. Because Jay, what I'd love to hear from you is just your thoughts now tasting Marian's St.Amant Lodi Native project. What stands out to you about this wine?
And again, another excellent Zinfandel. This one is elegant but powerful at the same time. There's a great linear power with this wine. The red fruit coming through with mainly dark cherry, raspberry, and but cherry really coming through to me. There's also a really strong hint of kola nut on this wine, and the because of no Nuno oak on this one, there's certainly some older unused probably French oak on this wine, so it really comes through with almost a chocolate cherry finish on this wine. Really, again, long and not too high in alcohol, not jammy either. So really, really well made and really pretty. And again, powerful too. So long finish, excellent wine again. And this is the kind of style of Zinfandel I like. When they get up over 16 plus and a little bit too bakey, sometimes I have a hard times with them. To me, just with alcohol. But this is again a real pretty wine and well made. And I'm thinking there might be a little stem in here. I'm getting a little phenolic that way, but maybe I'm mistaken.
So Stuart, do you want to add anything about the winemaking now that you've heard Jay's comments on it?
Yeah, I mean, there was no stems other than the few jacks that kind of get in there when the stemmer doesn't work perfectly, but that's pretty common. The oak on the wine, what I like to do on this particular wine is I like about 3 to 4 year old, and they were actually 70-gallon American oak barrels. So I find that age of barrel kind of gives a much more neutral presentation. When you start getting, you know, really old barrels, they can kind of add a old barrel quality to the wines. And so like I said earlier, it's a very kind of hands-off approach in this wine. It's usually the first pick we do of the vineyard and the ranch. One of the things I found with Lodi Zinfandels is we'll do multiple picks through there. So we usually do 3 or 4 picks on this block. And this one is usually one of the first ones I do, just to kind of really get a sense of how the vineyard's ripening up that year. And just natively fermented, pressed to neutral barrels and all malolactic and neutral oak, and then it's bottled after about 10 months in wood.
Well, and I really like how energetic, it's really quite palate stimulating, this wine. The tannin profile, I think, is just slightly different from the Stampede Vineyards. But Jay, I'm curious how do you feel inclined to use this particular wine at the table? Any differences here?
Well, I think the same thing. I think it's going to set up for any kind of smoke. Any kind of grill is going to be really, really nice with this wine. And I think, that's kind of where I would go here. I also think it'd be great with charcuterie, even before the meal. This wine could go to start with cheese and salumi and things like that. But again, I'm probably going to go with the grill on this one and fire something up that way, or use a smoke component in my food somehow.
The other thing that stands out to me about this wine too is it's got this really lovely elevated, fresh, bright red component to it. And again, that palate stimulation, but then it does go all the way down into the darker tones that you were mentioning, Stuart, and it's got this lovely finessed structure. And so in my mind, it really does show both the kind of finesse of the east side and the darker, fleshier tones of the west side. And so the combination makes just a really nice depth there. But so one of the questions that's coming in, quite a few people are really curious about this idea of own root vines in Lodi, and the sandier soils of McCollum River absolutely lend themselves to that. But Tegan, you're a perfect person to talk to us about that, because you're shifting now to talking about your Kirschenmann vineyard. It's located in a really unique part of McCollum River and Lodi area, and has one of the higher concentrations of old vine, own root, head trained Zinfandel vineyards. So could you tell us more about that?
Well, so the area it's a little hamlet called Victor, just about 3 miles east of the town of Lodi on Highway 12. And it's an old German industrial town, so it's only a couple hundred people. Most of the Germans came from Odessa, right around the time of the First World War, and the area was first developed in 1907 is when it went on the market, and it was sold as the Green Colony Tract, and they basically broke parcels up from 5 to 20 acres. So it was a smaller breakup, but it's right in the oxbow of the McCollum River. In theory, the McCollum River should come down and go straight through the town of Victor, but it hits and it heads north and does a big swoop around. And I think there are about 13 vineyards in that area that are planted between 1909 and 1919. I don't know of any smaller area. And everything that is planted in there, and those old vines are own rooted. And, you know, I think most of the research shows that sand is one thing, but it's actually, I think, the silica content that is the irritant for phylloxera and its ability to, you know, take over a vineyard. Yeah, it's a really neat place, you know, to grow grapes. And, you know, I'm just lucky that I get to work with the vineyard.
Well, and it's also, its proximity to the McCollum kind of influences how the temperatures and the airflow work too. Could you comment on that as well?
So, right. I mean, you kind of have, you know, you're getting it from all angles. So you have a constant airflow right around the vineyard year round and day round. And then, you know, at about 4 o'clock is when that usually the Delta breeze picks up. And I always, you know, the way I can tell when the Delta breeze, if you're out working in the vineyard, you usually actually don't notice it cooling you down first. You start hearing the train horns first. You know, when the Delta breeze slowly starts to pick up, you can start to hear the train horns have been going all day long, but right around, you know, 4, you start to hear them kind of just pulling out east. So
well, and it's because the sound, it's not that the train horns have increased literally, it's that the sound, what we can hear has changed because the wind has changed, right?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Right? The sound starts traveling further east, and it's a very gentle thing. It's a really calming thing when you hear, you know, these train horns. So most of the vineyards are, you know, own rooted out there. And, you know, I think one of the comments that Jay made about Zinfandel and can kind of lend to that green side. From my observation, we worked with over 40 Zin vineyards up and down the state. Own rooted Zinfandel seems to have, I mean, by definition, most Zinfandel outside of Lodi, the foothills, and the Delta is planted on St. George rootstock. Any grafted Zinfandel that's over 50 years old is on, for the most part, St. George rootstock. I think we're probably getting up there where some vines could be 50 years old on Freedom, but St. George rootstock by definition throws more shot berries than, you know, other rootstocks. I'm sure David could attest to that, but you see, I mean, it's one of the reasons why Cabernet fell out of favor in California on St. George is due to its shot berry, which is very, very synonymous with old vine Zinfandel, but you know, a lot of the old Chardonnay that has Wente shot berry is on St. George as well. So I see less of that personally in own rooted vines.
Yeah, so rootstock, it's something that we don't tend to talk about with the trade as much, but actually plays a really crucially important role in farming, health, and wine expression. And so, David, do you want to add anything to that? Like your experience working with grafted vineyards versus own rooted vineyards?
Sure. You know, I don't have as much experience with the own rooted. I have more experience with the St. George rootstocks, and that would be also the vineyard that we're going to talk wine. One thing I would say, so the shot berry itself is advantageous sometimes for Zinfandel because
Oh, for sure.
it's a undeveloped berry. And what that does is it just creates voids within the cluster so that you have less issue with rot. And because as the Zinfandel berries expand, it gives you a place for that expansion to occur without breaking berries and creating a rot issue. So I think that's actually advantageous for the old vine scene.
So one of the questions that's coming in, people are wondering if you see any difference in kind of evenness in the ripening from different rootstocks or specifically from own rooted. Do either of you see differences in how the fruit ripens or how evenly it ripens?
Well, I think that, I mean, I agree with David on everything he said. You know, it does create those voids, but you do have more shot undeveloped berries in St. George rootstock, basically across varieties. I think the reality is that most Zinfandel, old vine Zinfandel throughout the state, minus Lodi, is on St. George rootstock. I mean, the foothills is own rooted as well, but you know, the Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino area, I mean, that's all old Zinfandel there cannot survive on its own roots. So basically, the only thing we have to work with there is St. George, and you do see that shot berry, underdeveloped berries, you know, which I think, along with the sanitary issues that it helps eliminate with berry explosion, you also get more acidity, and it can lend to that, you know, that greenness, the good greenness, and you have, you know, a little bit more acid and snap to Zinfandels that have that.
Well, and St. George really, as a rootstock, speaks to a really important historical moment in California. There was a long period where that was really what was predominantly available, the best option. And so a lot of the older vineyards across the state, that's what you're going to be seeing is St. George. But, you know, Tegan, you mentioned, though, how many different Zinfandel vineyards you work with. And really importantly, you know, parts of the Central Coast, a lot of different areas of the North Coast, Mendocino, Napa, Sonoma, down in Paso Robles for the Central Coast, but multiple areas of the Sierra foothills, Contra Costa, and multiple vineyards in Lodi. And so I was wondering if you could comment on, you know, I've gotten to see you present before and spent a lot of time talking with you about how Zinfandel tends to show up in these different parts of the state. And so I wonder if you could comment on what do you see that stands out for Lodi Zinfandel versus some of these other areas that you work with?
Well, I think, I mean, most people have already kind of mentioned the differences. I do see a pretty big difference between East Side and West Side Lodi Zinfandel. And then Clements Hills, we have a vineyard that we've worked with since 1996 out there that we call Dogtown. And it's an own rooted vineyard that gets about less than a ton to the acre every year. And it has some of the aromatic profiles that I think you find in East Side Lodi, kind of, you know, black and green tea notes that you can pick up in some of the Eastern vineyards. But from a palate presence, you know, there aren't many wines like that. I think it's closer to what the photos showed with the Clements Hills. It's, you know, a lot of clay, a lot of rock. It's, you know, I mean, there were actually a lot of vernal pools there or that are still there. So it's shallower soil. And it doesn't seem to cool off as much at night there during the growing season, but it gets a little bit colder out there after harvest and during the winter. So sometimes we see a little bit later bud break, kind of the influence of the Sierra Nevadas on that Clements Hills area. But I think, you know, Lodi Zinfandel, and I think there are a lot of people here that can, you know, it is still only, you know, 25 years of making single vineyard Lodi Zinfandels. And I think, you know, in the scope of, you know, I was talking to someone recently about, you know, the wine industry in general and the wildfires and everything we're going through. And I'm like, for all intents and purposes, the wine industry in California is 150 years old. And that's not that long when you compare it to other, you know, wine producing areas. So, you know, the 25 years, you know, so 1/6 of the time we've made single vineyard Zinfandels. And, you know, I think the most important thing is people need to continue making single vineyard Zinfandels. And we're still trying to discover what certain sites offer. I mean, I'm sure David, with all his time, like, you work with that many wines, you don't have to taste the wine sometimes from a vineyard to have a broad idea of what it's going to taste like. But then there are always the times you make wines. The first time we made wine from the vineyard next to Kirschenmann Schmied back in 2009, I thought someone did something wrong with the wine. I mean, it was so red fruited. It was so, we had Lisa Granick came and blind tasted it. She goes, "That's Pinot Noir." I mean, she literally said that's Pinot Noir to a Lodi Zinfandel. And I mean, I like went back, we were barrel tasting. I went back with my flashlight just to see what barrel I grabbed, because I hadn't tasted the wine since it had finished malolactic, you know, and it was just, but I thought I knew what Lodi Zinfandel tasted like until we made those wines. And now, you know, I continue to expand my understanding and knowledge about what Lodi Zinfandel tastes like, you know, and I think some of the bigger blends have been amazing for the growers and for Lodi and for California wine. But, you know, I think now we're in this kind of Lodi 2.0 or 3.0 where it's like, what do these sites actually taste like? And, you know, I think it's, again, I would say David probably has more experience than most on knowing that, but we're still, you know, how do they age? How do they behave?
Well, and I mean, just to reemphasize one thing you said, Schmied is directly next door to Kirschenmann. They're similar, basically similar vine age, but they can taste profoundly different from each other.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell they're related. You can definitely tell they're related, but they're different wines. Right,
and then you're also working with Stacy, which is not that far from Kirschenmann.
Correct.
Yeah, and then
and that's actually on St. George. So that I believe it's, from what I know, it's the oldest Zinfandel in Lodi that's on St. George. The St. George section of that vineyard was planted in 1907. And it's primarily Zinfandel. There's Grenache Noir, beautiful Grenache vines, Mission, and Carignan out in the vineyard.
That's great. So Jay, moving to talking about the Kirschenmann vineyard, I love that we were able to get 4 single vineyard Zinfandels, because it really gives us the chance to see, you know, there's a kind of Lodi signature that we'll talk about at the end once we've tasted all 4. And yet these different parts of Lodi do have very distinctive expressions within them as well. So Jay, what are some of the first thoughts that you have smelling and tasting this Turley Kirschenmann?
Well, first of all, I just want to note that Zinfandel can be very Pinot Noir-like. And, you know, we do a lot of blind tasting with master sommeliers things and things like that. And I think everyone should consider, when blind tasting Zinfandel, that it could be Pinot or vice versa, especially these Pinots that get really hot. They sometimes smell like Zin, and cooler Zinfandel sometimes has the red fruit Pinot Noir notes to it. This wine is a powerful wine. This wine is extracted. It is it's got a lot of dark fruit on it, really a lot of dark cherry, dark plum. The oak is really, really integrated on it. It's higher in alcohol. There's a power and richness in this wine. It still makes it really, really well balanced, but a lot more dark fruit on this compared to the first 2, which were certainly red fruited. This has higher alcohol than the last 2 wines. So it's, again,
on the label. On the label, I will comment that it's higher alcohol on the label.
Yes, on the label, correct. Yes, it's.
I don't know if the wines, if it's actually higher alcohol in the wine.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, sir.
Turley gets. I'm gonna stick up. Turley gets a lot of grief because we always put the honest alcohol on the label, which I think only about 10% of people in the wine industry do that. A lot of people put allowable alcohols, but they don't put exactly what it is.
I totally agree, and I think you use your palate to defer that, because it's what, 1.5% play, right? This wine is at 15.1 is not that high in alcohol. There's Cabernets that are at least 1 point higher all over the place these days. I think the tannins are a little higher than the last 2 wines. This is a bigger, richer, fuller wine. Really, again, long finish, really excellent. I think, you know, I would probably grill up in New York and make a little a tapenade with some tomatoes and basil and a little bit of, put that over the top of this, and I think it'd be, really, really good. And I'll probably enjoy all three of these wines later this evening.
I really, I love that there's, again, that the tannin profile, I think, is in some ways comparable to the second wine in that it's really palate stimulating, which I love. And this wine has this wonderful mouth-watering quality that makes me want to keep going back to taste it. And I love too how it's, in my mind, something I don't always see, but sometimes what I see is the wines from vineyards closer to the river will almost get deeper toned. There's something I think about the effects of the airflow and the cooling elements of that air that I think will kind of make deeper toned flavors and sometimes and bring a kind of power to them. And I think sometimes we think of deeper toned fruits as automatically meaning a riper wine. But the thing that I've really seen from a lot of tasting experience around the world is that actually there's certain sites that because of the growing conditions, they're immediately already in deeper toned flavors. And it's not because the wine is riper, it's actually unique conditions of the site. And in my mind, Kirschenmann really consistently gives that kind of, there's a savory element and a lovely freshness to the wine with deeper tones. And I find that combination really exciting, that combination of freshness with deep fruits and savory elements. Again, it's really palate stimulating for me.
It's all really a perfectly ripe fruit. It's not overripe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and, I really get this really long chocolate cherry finish at the end that just goes on and on and on. It's got a crazy long finish. Tegan, what did you do with the oak regimen on this wine?
So with all the Turley Zinfandels, we do the exact same program, and it's about, we shoot for 20% new oak, and of that 80% is French and 20% is American. So I think this wine, when I looked up, it was about 18% new oak. Again, we shoot for 20%, but depending on how many barrels we end up with, it's never exact.
Yeah, so it's interesting too to note that this is the first of the 4 wines where we get some inclusion of American oak, and we'll keep talking about.
Well, Stuart's wine had American oak.
Oh, forgive me, excuse me. But, so do you want to comment at all on how you see that show up differently for Zinfandel French versus American? And we'll hear.
Well, I mean, the reason we use 20% is I don't like old barrels. I mean, we're not really using new oak as much as we try to rotate them through. So we keep our barrels about 6 to 7 years. And after 7-year-old barrels, I think the wines start to taste more like barrel than oak, if that makes sense.
Right,
you kind of taste the wine and you're like, wow, this doesn't taste like oak, but it tastes like it was aged. And, I think of like, neighbors' home wines that they're using like a really old barrel,
For me, it's like this musty, gray, powdery flavor.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so what we're really trying to do is, the American oak that we use medium toast, and we do toasted heads, but that only makes up 20% of the blend. So it's rare that this lot's big enough. We did about 1,000 or 1,100 cases of this. And we try to do 3 picks a year. So we kind of do a pick that's, the first pick I think wound up at around 14.2 alcohol. And then the next 2 picks were kind of in the, low 15s, but, picked at, 24 to 25 bricks. And then, no water was added to this. No acid was added to it. No, just sulfur. The wine gets racked a couple times. At first, after malolactic, it's all native yeast fermented and bottled after about 15 months. And if I had my way, we would pick it 5 times. It's just, with Lodi is a warm region, sometimes you have a couple picks scheduled, but Zinfandel can move a lot faster than you can. when the heat comes, you have this plan, and then, reality hits and you say, well, we wanted to pick it at 24, but it's already 24.8. Let's pick the next day and the next day and just get it done. So yeah, we're kind of, it's a 15-acre vineyard, so it's a decent amount of old vines. We get about 2.25 tons the acre every year. So it's not a lot of fruit, but it's fun to have different lots in the cellar to play with.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the questions that came in earlier, and Jeff, maybe you can comment on this too from the grower perspective, is just people are curious that, a few of you have mentioned doing multiple picks, and anyone can jump in here, but I thought I'd start with Jeff. Is that something in the sort of 2 generations of farming that you've been witness to there? Have you seen that increase over time, a move towards kind of multiple pick dates rather than one big one?
Yeah, well, it's all going to depend on, who the customer is. If you're working with one of the big brands, Delicados, Gallos, they're going to come in one fell swoop and pick the whole vineyard in, a day or two, or depending on how big the vineyard is. We tend to work with a lot of smaller producers. And they have kind of a breadth of criteria they want to pick for. So we tend to do multiple picks at each vineyard. It's not, I think this year we did them, for us, typically maybe about 3 to 4 picks per vineyard, but it's all customer driven. Usually one customer may want 2 different pick dates, but it's all going to depend on the style and what the end target is for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So thank you. And Tegan, one last question for you before we shift to talking about LangeTwins. Because you do work with vineyards kind of across the whole breadth, far west to of Lodi, well into Clements Hills. One of the questions coming in is, can you comment on comparison of harvest dates, differences between those? And David would be great to comment on that as well.
All the Zinfandel that we work with, the old vines are, it's, you got to have your picking knife sharpened by Labor Day. It's kind of all depending on, where it's at. But historically, we're picking, the first week to the second week of September in a normal year. You look at some of the drought years and we were picking like the 15th of August. It's rare that we've ever picked any old vine Zinfandel after like the 15th of September. So if you kind of put it on, and it always depends, when one vineyard's behind, it's usually because it has an extra 1/4 ton to the acre on it. And you can kind of say, well, why is Dogtown, a little behind? And then you pick it and you go, oh, right, it had a little bit more fruit. Right. But it's really the first 2 weeks of September, I think, is, it's kind of Zinfandel time.
Yeah, thank you. So, something that, I think people often assume that temperature and ripeness in a strict temperature sense is what determines picking time, but it's really important for us to remember, again, water availability, like you just alluded to with the drought reference, that can actually impact appropriate picking time, but also the yield in any particular year. Sometimes clusters are just bigger. It's just the vintage conditions. Sometimes berries are just bigger or there's fewer of them. And that can be natural vintage variation, but also some producers could prefer to leave more or less crop, and all of those aspects will influence when a vineyard is ready to pick, as well, of course, as style. But David, do you want to add anything in terms of picking variation across kind of the breadth of Lodi?
Sure. Just a couple comments. Way back when I first started with the industry back in the 1980s, we generally didn't start harvest until after Labor Day. And I don't know, I don't want to get into the political weeds of climate change or anything like that, but certainly there has been, I think, progress to a certain extent, the types of viticulture that we're applying, but also that we're better at it and that we're able to get ripeness earlier, phenological ripeness. The other thing is that, especially for the old vine zins too, in general, it is a bit of a more narrow window as far as when they actually kind of get ripe and ready for harvest, just because the crop levels, while they can change a little bit, they are in a much more kind of a smaller range of yield as far as that.
Right.
From the old vine that we get, it's as low as 2.5, and it can go up to 3.5. Overall, as a percentage, that can be a pretty wide swing, but as a kind of a grape variety, it's, in general, talking about Bordeaux Reds or Chardonnays, we can have pretty wide swings of 4 tons within a field for Chardonnay, for example, which we saw this year. We were actually down about 30% on Chardonnay goods. So, so that's my kind of comment about old vines. They kind of react to the vintage, and they kind of set their own pace, as it were. They don't go too high, they don't go too low, and that's something that I really think is pretty unique about old vines.
Right, and so if I hear you right, part of another benefit of old vines is they tend to have a more consistent yield year to year across different growing conditions by vintage.
True.
Yeah, that's great. So one of the things that you have such a unique history in the region, and I think it's really important to kind of highlight that. And so I'm going to ask you to talk about your own history of work in Lodi, because I think it's so valuable to talk about, but especially because an integral part of that history is that you really have, previously working with Mondavi and now working with LangeTwins, who had also worked with Mondavi. You have this really unique firsthand experience of having seen a really crucial shift in perspective there in Lodi. As Stuart alluded to, that, your work with Mondavi was really about working firsthand with growers and helping them to see how did these growing choices play out in the wine. But you've continued in your commitment working with grower families, and this fourth wine really reflects that. But could you tell us more about kind of your firsthand experience and the evolution you've seen there?
Indeed, yeah. It's been really an amazing process, and I think the Mondavis. Well, first know that the Mondavis were actually, when they moved to this area, Cesare Mondavi lived in Lodi, as with the boys. Robert lived here as well. In fact, I lived maybe 2 blocks away from their original house. And they had a rather thriving business at that time. A lot of it was packing fruit, especially during the Prohibition, packing fruit and sending it back east for home winemakers, as it were. What I like is that this region, we didn't get a lot of notoriety as far as producing wines for consumption. We really, as Stuart mentioned, were defined by rather large wineries that, the grapes, beautiful vineyards would go into supporting our wines, but at the same time, were anonymous to a certain extent. It was a Lodi Zinfandel, but that was about as far as it went. It wasn't that we had these wonderful, beautiful, unique old vine zins that were now really seen as an amazing benefactor for, it's funny how back in the day when people immigrated and they did plant Zinfandels here, that they had a lot of foresight in what they did and what they planted. And, 100 years later, they were really proven right. What I do like about Zinfandel is, and for some reason through the years, we've been able to keep it in the ground. And it has gone through many different iterations. Again, I do know that back in the 70s, 80s, it was a backbone of Hardy Burgundy from Gallo. And then after that, there was a resurgence of all things, white Zinfandel from Southern Home. It still kept old vine Zinfandel in the ground. So imagine that, this beautiful Zinfandel was actually used to produce white Zinfandel, just a simple, bright, low alcohol wine, that really didn't do it justice. And so as that kind of progressed and we started getting more people instead of these larger wineries, we had people coming into the area and really helped, I think, define the Lodi appellation as being an area that can support some very unique wines, but also very historical in the sense, especially relative to the Zinfandels in this region. And so it's just an amazing thing for me to see this transition from anonymity to having people like Tegan and Fields family and the Langs all coming together to really present a unique aspect of what this Lodi region represents in the wine industry.
Well, and so we've talked too about just the importance of grower families in Lodi, and you just mentioned that foresight that so many of them had, but the LangeTwins specifically, the Lang family has a really important history there. And could you tell us more about that?
First off, it's pretty amazing to me that any business is able to be passed down to the next generation.
Yeah.
The Langs have actually farmed and been a part of the agriculture in Lodi for over 5 generations now. And that is, to me, a real testament to, I think, not only their goals as far as what they want to do for their families, but also being responsible in how they farm so they can pass it along to the next generation. And so it really changes how you look at your business. You're not very short-sighted. You're not living quarter to quarter. You're actually looking at that 5, 10, 20-year kind of business plan, and what the cause and effect is short-term, but the long-term effect is what you really look for in those generational families. And so what I really like, especially in the Lodi appellation, is the growers here. They're really salt of the earth. They really recognize that you just don't farm for quantity. And that's one of the reasons why I like working with the LangeTwins. They're always interested in producing better quality wines, not just this year, but next year, and improve every year thereafter. And that was something that was really, I think, ingrained to them with the Mondavis, and really seeing, as Stuart mentioned, what you did in the vineyard and how it turned out as finished wines. And so it really, I think, progressed the Lodi appellation from, funny thing is, back in the 80s, you probably wouldn't, there were no Bordeaux Reds here. There was no Spanish varieties. We had Burger, we had French Colombard, we had some Tokay that was actually made into other varieties and distilling.
Yes. Yeah.
But Tokay is also, and I'm sure you'll talk a little bit later about it, how it played a part in developing the Lodi appellation boundaries there. And so for us, I think, especially back in the 80s when we were first planting a lot of different varieties, there was a big learning curve as far as developing the region and growing the breadth of wines and the varieties that we could produce in the Lodi appellation. So there, I think what I like most is there's a lot of old history, especially with the Zinfandels, but there's a lot of new histories with really identifying the opportunities that we can grow in Lodi.
Yes, no, thank you. I was able to spend the day driving around with Brad Lang, and really, I was really impressed with how there is this deep respect for the history of vineyards in Lodi, and yet at the same time, there is this profoundly future-looking perspective. And so it was really quite an interesting day because we were able to look at a full range of old own root head trained vineyards, all the way to different types of wire training, and then even the kind of the newest thing with high wire, which is quite interesting. And so it was really an interesting day, and I learned a lot from him. But one of the things I want to be sure to mention is LangeTwins as a business is not just focused on farming and improving wine quality, but it actually has really taken their experience with the place and their land ownership with the place quite seriously in doing a lot of restoration work. And so in the day that I spent with Brad Lang, we actually were able to go to all of these areas along rivers and small lakes and ponds that LangeTwins have actually worked to restore. And Kayla, could you go ahead and show us? We have one photo that from my day with Brad. It's this beautiful, a little bit secluded, but still actually not very far outside of town. Right there in Lodi, there's just this beautiful small lake or pond that has been fully restored as wetland. And the thing to know is that only a couple decades ago, this was not a pond at all. It had been a fully dried area. The river had the kind of outer boundaries of the river, sort of gold sluicing had caused a lot of sand runoff from the mountains and had filled in the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers so that a lot of the natural habitat had been lost. But the LangeTwins have actually worked to restore natural habitat and kind of recover some of the even 100-year-old damage that had been done. And this is an example of a really just quite beautiful pond area that is a little bit from the river and really just on the edge of town. But the natural wildlife that was there was really quite moving and beautiful to see as well. David, do you want to comment any more on the restoration work that's being done?
Yeah, what was, again, I think that really goes back to that viewpoint of generational. What do we do? We just don't farm. We really respect the land that we are deriving a livelihood from, but also that agriculture can also be invasive to the natural habitats as well. And so the Langs took it upon themselves to create habitat restorations in a way that really started bringing back, as you mentioned, these beautiful habitats for a real plethora of wildlife and bringing nature back. And again, that to me respects a lot of the farmers from this region. They really think about nature and, again, sustainability, and really have, I think, a true kind of rhythm of nature, as it were, and they really respect it in a way that, because I think they're so close to it. Mm-hmm. And what was actually very fascinating about that whole aspect too is they did it just because they felt it was the right thing to do. And that's something I really like about the Langs and the LangeTwins family. And also because of that, they received a national award from the Leopold Foundation that also really recognized their efforts in that habitat restoration. And so that was really a surprise to them. But at the same time, it was really a recognition of what they had done just because they felt it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think it's something that's not talked about a lot, but I think it really deserves our talking about it. And so thank you for helping to say more about that. But now this part of what's interesting to me too is, so LangeTwins, as you said, they're farming in Lodi and they certainly have their own vineyards, but this wine that we're looking at today, single vineyard Zinfandel, and you've actually chosen to work with a different grower family in order to make it. So tell us more about this particular vineyard and why go ahead and work with this vineyard when you have so many others you could be using as well.
Indeed, so this vineyard that we see is Charlie Lewis vineyard. In fact, he's probably 95, 96 years old and thriving as an individual. Charlie's father was good friends with the LangeTwins' father as well. And so they actually grew up and together. Again, it once again kind of brings full circle that close-knit farming community, as it were. So the roots go way back with the Lewis family. So this, the Lewises, I've known them since they started. Again, when we started producing Zinfandels and started getting these old vine Zinfandel contracts for just making Woodbridge Zinfandel, we knew that this was an absolute gem to work with. And when another winemaker, as we grew it, another winemaker from Woodbridge recognized that the Lewis Vineyard, Karen, her name was Karen Birmingham, she knew that the contract was coming up on Lewis, and she said, we got to go get that vineyard. And then we started going a little bit deeper and find out that, again, Charlie was great friends. His dad was great friends with the Langs. And so it was actually a pretty easy conversation that we wanted to be able to really bring in and make a special wine from Charlie's vineyard.
Well, and so Jay, I'm excited to hear your thoughts on this particular wine here in a moment. But one of the things I love about this wine and that consistently stands out to me is there's a way in which it really celebrates the history of Zinfandel in California and the signature of Zinfandel in California. And so I'll ask you about winemaking in a minute, but first I'd like to hear, Jay, again, we have 4 different expressions of Zinfandel, an honest range of Lodi Zinfandel. And so what are some of the things that stand out to you in smelling and tasting this particular wine?
This is a big boy here, and the fruit is ripe, but also pretty much the first wine that actually has gone to a little bit more of a baked and kind of a jammy nose to me on this wine, but really well, again, put together. Dark cherry, dark plum, and blackberry are kind of the components I get. That sandy, rocky minerality does come through. The oak is really integrated as well on this. There's a subtle vanilla and cinnamon going through here, but not in your face or over oaked in any way. Again, really, really long finish. There's a strong kind of a smell of tangerine to me on this wine, which is kind of a Zinfandel thing to me, where I get that dark fruit, but I also get that little bit of a citrusy, orangey kind of a thing mixed in with the red fruit, which to me is really highlighting, and I really like that. Again, I like the finish on it is long, it's rich, it's big, really, again, pretty wine, and to me, more of a, what I would think of more of a classic, almost, I've had more experience drinking I think Sonoma Dry Creek Zins than I have in Lodi, and I'm really excited to taste through these wines, and I'm learning so much from all you. It's really exciting. I look forward to, showing and talking about these wines in the future. One of the questions I had for the winemakers, these old vines, these old rootstocks, were they Augustin Harathi when he went to Sonoma and got those cuttings in the late 1800s? Are these some of those cuttings that he brought himself, or did the source of the fruit from these old vines come from somewhere else?
Well, he actually wasn't the one who brought in Zinfandel. Zinfandel came a couple different places in southern part of Northern California. The first place Zinfandel was planted was actually in Napa Valley in 1852. It wasn't planted, it was actually grafted onto Mission. But there was an importation to the foothills as well. But Captain McCondry was the person who brought in Zinfandel. So I think, there were a decent amount of, the big winery in the San Joaquin Valley at the time was actually in Stockton. And, there was a big importation of Zinfandel, and one of the interesting things, like in the Kirschenmann vineyard, there's actually a lot of Mondouse Noir in the vineyard from 1915, which we've DNA tested it. And I haven't found any other vineyards. So to me, I don't know exactly where the cuttings came from, but the vineyards around in that area don't have any Mondouse, and my vineyard doesn't have any Alicante, which all the vineyards surrounding of age have at least one Alicante vine. So I think the good question, and this is one of those things with, I'm part of the Historic Vineyard Society, is we don't know. There's very few direct links to a certain nursery and a certain planting.
Yeah. So just to give just a slight detail add on to what Tegan was just talking about. So historically, late 1800s, a lot of the Zinfandel vineyards were planted as what we call mixed blacks vineyards, and they were most often mixed blacks in the sense of being a kind of, the heart of the vineyard was Zinfandel, and they were interplanted with predominantly 3 vineyards, but really it could be a massive mix. And there's sort of a historical curiosity in that, like Tegan was just pointing out, some vineyards are profoundly mixed. Some vineyards have cutting, varieties that you just don't really see anywhere else. And sometimes you'll see a vineyard and you just know the person that planted it was profoundly curious because there's so many unexpected, unusual things. But predominantly, Zinfandel tended to be planted with Alicante Boucher, which did a really nice job of bringing some color and some kind of fruit character. Petite Syrah, that did a really nice job bringing some kind of depth or darker color, but also a lot of structure. And then Carignan, which does a nice job of kind of bringing an acid out, and we'll talk about that more in a second as well. But as Tegan was just explaining, Augustin gets a lot of credit, but what we've been able to find out is that actually his nephew was a really good PR agent. Kind of the advent of PR in California was Augustin's nephew, and after Augustin had actually already disappeared and been pronounced dead, though they didn't actually find him, his nephew kind of retroactively told a big story about all the varieties that had been brought in. But actually, as Tegan was saying, Zinfandel had already been brought in the 1850s, and El Pinal, Pinal, was the first vineyard or first winery in the greater Lodi area, just outside Stockton, as Tegan mentioned, established in 1858, from what I recall. So
Can we ask David how he makes this wine?
Yeah, that's what I was just about to do. So,
because it reminds me of a Saint-Emilion, almost like a Grand Cru Class A Saint-Emilion. It almost, goes to right bank, really high quality Bordeaux to me.
Well, and so it's a great example, Jay, your comment about, what we've heard through this is that when you look at an honest range of Zinfandel, you can see that sometimes it points to lighter bodied Pinot, sometimes it points even to more structure and flavor character of Bordeaux blends even. And so I think too, one of the things to mention is that Zinfandel producers can often think of Zinfandel differently. So some can think of making Zinfandel more like a Bordeaux with that structured focus. Some can think of it with a lighter touch, more like Pinot focus. And so we've heard a little bit about how this wine shows up, but David, could you tell us briefly just how you made it? What are the key things to know there?
So Jay, you're really showing your street cred as far as kind of parsing out a wine. One of the things that we do, we don't do a lot of differential harvesting. We do try and pick it all at once. There was a quick, I want to make a quick comment about ripeness on the vines. One thing about old vine Zins, because they're head pruned, the fruit exposures and aspects as the sun travels from east to west during the day, you get different exposures throughout the day, and that and yet the fruit itself is all in the 360-degree kind of radius. Unlike a lot of current plantings where we have east-west rows or north-south rows, the exposures are much more predictable. So in old vine Zins, you have a lot of different variability, and I think also you have some unique ripeness differences as well. One of the things I think that the exposures that give us too is when we talk about that spice and black teak aromatics, that comes from that direct sun exposure from the fruit itself. And I think that really is a real tell for Lodi Zinfandels themselves. So we do pick when we feel that the ripeness is right. I actually do work very closely with Charlie. He's stopped me a couple times from picking. And who am I to go against 95-year-old wisdom, as it were. Jay made a comment about the Bordeaux red kind of qualities of the wine. It might be just because I was a Mondavi winemaker, and cut my teeth on doing a lot of Bordeaux reds, but because this wine really feels like it can manage with extended maceration, we do a couple different things. We do a cold soak when we first start it. One of the things we do that because we want to understand the juice chemistry, as it were, as it came in for harvest. And then we do a normal fermentation. We do use a special selection of yeast because it is 16 alcohol, although it doesn't really, I don't think it really presents as high in alcohol because there's so many other aromatics that come up with that wine. But we also do what we call an extended maceration. So from the crushing, that's the first day, to the actual pressing, it's a minimum of 21 days. And we like that because, we feel like we're getting the most out of both the skins and the seed tannins. And there is this really wonderful kind of polymerization of phenolics as it does an extended maceration. So that when we do finally press, we feel we get the most out of the grape. We actually look for more of that chocolate block kind of tannins when we do press the wine. So it has a lot of extractive qualities. And the reason for that is because when it goes into barrels, what we want to do is have a lot of grape tannin. Now, grape tannin shows up more kind of in that finish. So it kind of gradually comes up on the palate. So it's more in the back of the palate. Barrel tannins come up more in the front of the palate. So it's more that aggressive first pop. And so what we like when, and I'll get to the barrels themselves, but that barrel tannin presents a tannin arc from the front of the palate to the grape tannins to the back. And so you have this really nice arc on the palate itself. You have that really nice richness and this continuity from the front of the palate to the back because of the barrel tannins meeting the grape tannins. Now the barrels themselves are a little bit unique. Now we do use American oak barrels. And so you do get some of the whiskey lactones, the vanillas, and the really wonderful kind of spices. You don't get a lot of what I consider more the negative kind of coconutty flavors. I don't really like that in a red wine. but part of that reason is these are bourbon barrels, and way back in the day, I remember when they first made these barrels for wines, they were bourbon producers selling barrels to wineries as a barrel to use for aging. And so that was really about 6 months of curing, basically, of the wood itself. And they did that just so it's stable enough so they could bend it and turn it into a barrel. And boy, those were tough wines to make. And I rejected a lot of barrels at that point. What's happened with the barrel industry in the United States is that a lot of the French producers have come to the United States to use French aging techniques to produce American oak barrels. And one of the keys there is aging the wood in kind of the environment. And so in Missouri and Kentucky and those regions, they'll cut in the American oak, and you can cut American oak into quarter saws. So it's stave lengths and widths, and they leave it in the environment for normally just 24 months. Barrels we use are 30 months out in the environment. They'll restack them sometimes, and so there's a tempering of that oak, the American oak. So that original kind of aggressive oak that you'll get from American oak barrel is much more tempered. It actually there's some mycelia that forms on them during the season, and they find that does also help with the aging and the curing process of the oak. I'm sorry, I'm getting too long on this one, but I think it's provides a barrel that really works with the wine. And I think that's one thing I really like about, again, the longer aging and a little bit longer toasting out also that we do to create these wines.
Yeah, thank you. We do need to wrap up our Zinfandel talk so we can talk about 2 more wines. But I just want to clarify one thing. I just went back and tasted through the 4 Zinfandels, and I have to say that one of the things I'm really grateful that we were able to do with this seminar is, again, have 4 really honest expressions of Zinfandel from Lodi and an honest range. And, I think that Zinfandel often these days especially kind of gets a bad rap in some ways. And the retasting these wines, again, it's a beautiful range of expressions and all really respectfully made. And I know, Jay, as he was talking about the Turley, I took it you were kind of trying to find your words a little bit, and so mentioned alcohol twice. But when I retaste the wine, I really want to emphasize that it's beautifully balanced. And what I see in each of these 4 Zinfandels is this respect for the site. Each of them are single vineyard wines. Each of them have a real respect for the site, and at the same time, a respect for the style of expression they're choosing from the site. And there is a stylistic difference across the 4. Some of that is from the vineyard each of them comes from, but the kind of common thread in my mind is this again, beautiful palate stimulation from Lodi Zinfandel. There's lovely mouth-watering length in each of the 4 wines. There is difference and variation in the tannin expression, I think, and the tone of the fruit, but they're each beautifully balanced versions of themselves, so to speak. And while we did see a range of expression in alcohol, I want to emphasize, I think each of the wines really carries their honest alcohol really well. And I think it's important to emphasize what Tegan pointed out, that some producers choose to really honestly state what the winemaking or the alcohol choices were in a wine, and in an industry where not everyone honestly states, sometimes people that do can be misunderstood in their intentions. And so I'm really thankful to each of you for representing your Zinfandels here and showing such a beautiful range of Lodi Zin. But we do want to talk about 2 more wines. And so we don't have a producer here for these last two, so we'll talk just a little bit less about them, but still want to be sure that we respectfully show them. And so we wanted to show some of the other red varieties that are growing in Lodi, and we're going to do that again more tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll really dig into the other AVAs of Lodi. We'll spend some time talking about whites of Lodi and a couple of other red varieties as well. But today we're going to also look at both Grenache and Carignan. And Tegan, I was hoping I could actually ask you to talk a little bit about Grenache. It's a historically important variety for California. It's also found in some field blends with Zinfandel, but you've also worked with it from different parts of California. And this happens to be a Lodi appellated Grenache, and we'll learn a little bit more about the vineyard in a minute. But I was hoping you could just comment about the variety and sort of what stands out to you, but that we should know about Grenache and perhaps also in Lodi specifically.
Well, I mean, there's a hipster joke. It's like, what do you plant, where no other grapevines want to grow? And the answer is Grenache, because of its hardiness. Grenache can grow anywhere. It can, and it definitely does well in the Mediterranean climate. If you've ever been to Priorat or northern Spain or the south of France, I mean, Grenache can handle the struggle. And historically, there was a lot more Grenache planted in the Central Valley and in Lodi that went into jug wines. There's a lot of debate on, there's more or less 4 different Grenaches that people talk about. There's Grenache Blanc, Grenache Gris, Grenache Noir, and then there's also something that people, if you look at Grenache Noir that you see, and there's Grenache Rouge. So, it definitely can play to its environment. But historically, I think a lot of the Grenache that was planted in California was more on the Grenache Rouge side. It didn't really turn black like you see Grenache Noir. And that's what you see primarily in old field blends, something that's kind of between Gris and Noir. But it can be a heavy bearer. It's very drought tolerant, and it gets sun bleaching but not sunburn. The big difference in it, and it definitely doesn't tend to shrivel like you see. Zinfandel can really suffer from heat and sun direct exposure, where Grenache doesn't do that in the same way. It has its own issues where it kind of bleaches and loses color, but Zinfandel the berry can collapse, where Grenache doesn't. Grenache just kind of basks in that sun.
Well, and the clusters can be enormous on some sites.
Right.
I mean, like I've seen clusters that are bigger than my head.
I've seen 3-pound Grenache clusters are not a common thing. The people down in the Central Coast who make the 100-point wines, they make these little boxes. They cut off the toes, they cut off the shoulders, they kind of make them into a little square. I've seen where they grow like watermelons in boxes. They make square watermelons. That's what a lot of people will do in the Central Coast to make high-end Grenache. They really manipulate the cluster growth. I mean, I think there's probably a future in high-end Grenache. They have the sand that, one winemaker friend from South Africa, when he looked at Lodi soil maps, said Lodi McCalmy River is one giant sand squirt. It's just the same way they talk about Chateau Rayos as a sand squirt. Mm-hmm. You have the McCalmy River that's basically squirted out the sand, and so Grenache and sand kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, it's historically Zinfandel really got established first with watermelon, then with Flame Tokay, wonderful table grape that also, as David mentioned, does really well with distilling, and then of course with Zinfandel. But I think, Tegan, what you're pointing out is that it's actually a perfect growing region for Grenache, and that's part of why we wanted to include this today. But Stuart, I was hoping you could, Kayla, maybe you could pull up one of my favorite photos ever, and then Stuart, if you could tell us more about the AVA family and the AVA brothers that we see here.
Yeah, so
I love this photo so much.
Yeah, this was a very fun day. I took you out here to meet with, this is Louis and his brother Joe AVA, and I think Louis in his late 80s and Joe's in his early 90s, if I got it correct. But
yeah, Joe's on the right. He's early 90s, still driving his own tractor to farm Cabernet.
yeah, and and they just start telling stories going back to when they first came to Lodi, and I couldn't leave. I was just it was so so engaging, them telling the stories of and how hard a work they had to put into what they did back then as a a family farm. But the other thing I found fascinating about Louis is about 2 hours into our meeting, he goes kind of wandering off and comes back with this unlabeled bottle of wine. He's an Italian immigrant, I think, from the Piedmont region, and he's made wine at home from this vineyard going back to the 1920s. And so I like to say Louis is the oldest and longest living winemaker in Lodi, and having made like 70 plus vintages of single vineyard Zinfandel from their home ranch right there off of Dustin Road. And anytime a home winemaker brings out a bottle of wine, you're always like, uh-oh, what am I in for? And it was absolutely delicious.
It was such a beautiful wine. But it really felt like it was this moment where he decided, you know what, I like these guys. I'm gonna share my wine with you. And for me, it was this incredible compliment, that he wanted to show his wine. And we ended up finding out that is not their vineyard, by the way. We ended up finding out that it was actually the 72nd vintage of Zinfandel home wine he had ever made that we were enjoying with him. And it was actually from several vintages ago. I believe this year would be his 76th or 77th vintage of winemaking from what I can recall based on that conversation. But totally wonderful family. And Louis' son Phil farms the vineyard now, and it was established as a head trained Zinfandel mixed blacks vineyard. But in the 90s they realized it was time to keep looking forward and to see what else could grow, and that's when they established Grenache planted on its own, and they also have some Syrah that's beautifully made from the site. So Jay, coming back to you now, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about this particular Grenache, and then I'll fill us in on some of the winemaking.
Pretty classic Grenache smell that's got that kind of grilled strawberry. When I think about Grenache and I'm trying to blind taste a wine, I kind of go to the grilled strawberry thing. And so it's almost like, there's a smoke on a fresh berry in a way. There's this kind of, maybe a little kind of immediate thing that goes along with it. But to me, this wine has this really pretty red strawberry, red cherry, light red cherry, raspberry as well. There's a nice earthy component that comes through, rocky in a way, slightly some like dried herbs kind of going along in there, and fresh. I'm not getting a lot of oak on this wine at all. Maybe some used barrel, but not much new, if any. Tannins are just medium. The wine's rich. It's got almost a white chocolate finish on this wine, and really clean and pretty. Nice wine. Most of my experience with Grenache is with Chateauneuf du Pape or Priorato, and they'll have different expressions depending on what is blended. I'm guessing this is 100% Grenache. It might not be.
It is 100%, yes.
So it's not going to have some of those tannins that you might get with some of the other things that are blended in. But nice, pretty fruit, easy to drink. This wine is a quaffer.
Mm-hmm. Well, and something that I appreciate about this wine too is, it's actually quite easy for Grenache to get a little bit syrupy, but this wine has done a nice job of maintaining structure while keeping the tannin pretty approachable, and it the acid, lots of nice length on this wine that makes it really.
Can I add something to it? Because
yes,
I've
Tegan,
spent some time in the vineyard. It is a unique vineyard for Lodi, in the development of it, but also in the way that it's farmed. So it's actually, the row spacing here is 6 foot wide, which you see more common in some of the hillsides of Napa and Sonoma. So it's 6-foot spacing, so very narrow rows for concentration. And then Phil actually goes to one cluster per shoot originally, and then goes and continues to thin the vineyard down. I mean, it definitely looks, it's a more manicured, tight spaced vineyard than you find typically in Lodi. I mean, it's a real gem. And he actually ripped out old vine Cinsault that was in the front to plant this. He said, I wish I would have kept the Cinsault now, but yeah.
It's no, Phil, he's such a thoughtful farmer, and he's actually a 4th generation farmer there in Lodi. The Louis and Joe's father came over just after the World Fair in San Francisco. I think that was the 1880s. Ended up in Lodi, and then found some land in Mokelumne River, what's now Mokelumne River area. Went back to Italy, got his parents and a wife. Went and settled in Lodi, had Joe and Louis, taught them how to farm and make wine. And then Louis, of course, taught Phil how to. And Phil has, he's really quite a thoughtful winemaker, again, working with Zinfandel, but also Rhone varieties there. And so we want to finish up now talking about, again, a historically important variety, Carignan, in Lodi. And before we do that, though, Jeff, I'm curious, you're working with these 3 different Zinfandel sites, and over time, some sites have been kind of carefully replanted to be entirely Zinfandel based. Historically, almost all of them were established as field blends, but over time, sometimes vineyards were replanted to kind of pull the oddballs out and put in Zinfandel cuttings. And so I wonder what you see on your 3 sites. How much variation is there, and does it differ between them at all?
Yeah, I think, the older the vineyard is, the higher chance there will be that there is some variation within the vineyard. The only site of our 3 that really does have any variation is Stampede, so the one that we've been talking about today. So we have quite a few mission vines in there, and they really do stand out. They're quite a bit bigger than the Zinfandel vineyards. There is some Mourvedre, and there was some Tokay. There's a few Cinsault. And lately I've been finding a lot of old, believe it or not, Grenache that had been topped and regrafted to Zinfandel. So there's a lot of funny things like that I found. We took the opportunity to, we had a few missing vines. We had quite a few missing vines, actually. So in our replants, we did replant with some low yielding, high color Grenache, Alicante, and a few others, some Carignan and a few other here and there. But primarily, I think the older the vineyard is, the higher chance you'll find other varieties.
Right. And so now, an interesting change moment for California in general, but Lodi as well, is, prohibition hits in, and interestingly enough, vineyard plantings across the state of California and in Lodi actually increased during prohibition. A lot of people assume that they would have gone down because winemaking ostensibly reduced during prohibition. But actually, under prohibition, it was legal for heads of household to make a small amount of home wine. And to do that, they needed fruit. And so plantings in Lodi actually increased during prohibition. And across the state of California, a lot of what increased was actually Carignan. And the reason is because it was a relatively hardy vine, but also relatively hardy fruit. And so the fruit could actually handle transport across country by train. And the vineyard that we're going to turn to looking at now, Mule Plain, is actually from that era, planted in the 1920s by the Shin family. And we have a great photo of Bill and John Shin, father and son, who have worked the vineyard. It is, let's see, John, I believe, is 4th generation farmer. There's so many Shins across Lodi. I've actually had to almost draw a family tree to work it all out in my mind. But John here, the younger of the 2, farms this Carignan vineyard. And one of the things I really love about this vineyard, Bill told me that his grandfather actually had planted the Carignan, and then Bill went off, I think it was to school, but he left Lodi for a short period of time. And while he was gone, his father and his brother took over farming the family farm. And Bill came back home and found out that his brother and father were planning on pulling out the Carignan. and because things were changing and they were going to go ahead and put everything to wire and plant rows of the newer varieties. And Bill decided it was not okay to pull his grandpa's vineyard, and he was not going to stand for it. And so he threw a fit and demanded that they were going to leave it. And they said, don't be silly. And they got the tractor and were getting ready to pull it out. And so he chained himself to the biggest Carignan vine he could find and just laid down right in the middle of the vine rows and said, you know, if you're going to pull these vines, you're going to have to run over me. And, and so his father and brother got the message and left them. And now decades later, we're able to taste this particular wine from that site. So I love that story. And it gets at kind of the staunch dedication and attachment I think people who grew up in Lodi have to the place. And, you know, and Tegan, you didn't grow up in Lodi, but you grew up in California, and it's really become a kind of home for you as well. And there's just something about the place that I think does that. But so this particular Carignan site, though, you know, again, in McCollum River, and Tegan, forgive me for calling on you again, but I know you know Nathan Candler, the winemaker, quite well.
Yeah, he's one of my closest friends.
That's right. And so I thought it would be fair to ask if you would kind of speak to what he does. And one of the things, though, I think it's also important to bring out here is, you know, Nathan actually lives in Santa Cruz Mountains, but he goes to Lodi to buy fruit. And Tegan, you, of course, live in Napa. You have a home in Lodi and a vineyard in Lodi. But both of you, Nathan and you, Tegan, are examples of how Lodi has this staunch, multi-generational, dedicated community, and has also really welcomed in people from outside that care about Lodi and are really reinvigorating how Lodi thinks about its own wines. And so I was hoping you could kind of comment on that a little bit as well.
Well, so Nathan, he is a Michigan native, graduate of Fresno State. And at Fresno State, unfortunately went to school with Kevin Phillips and Adam Mettler. And so that's kind of his introduction.
Both famous in Lodi, just as
his introduction. Another joke is, you know, Schin's a Northern German meaning for Mettler. So Nathan is a Pinot Noir trained winemaker. He makes the wines at Thomas Fogey, but he actually worked in Sonoma with John Schin when before he went to Fresno State. That's how he met John. And he makes this wine kind of like classic Burgundy Pinot Noir. So it's 100% whole cluster fermented. It's aged in Burgundy barrels, used Burgundy barrels, and I think he racks it after malolactic, and he racks it one other time before bottling. But it's a very, you know, Burgundian kind of Dujac, you know, Comte de Vogüé, you know, style of wine. And I think it works really well. You know, I think he picks around 22 and a half bricks. You know, the grapes are black and fully ripe. And, you know, I've never had luck myself with getting Carignan really ripe. It kind of gets to 22 and a half and it kind of stays there, and you start to lose acidity. And then it's like, oh, it might get to 23 and loses more acidity. So I think he picks on that earlier side to keep the wine fresh. Mm-hmm. And I don't have the wine with me, but I've had it many times, and I really love the wine. I think it's very drinkable, and, you know, just a beautiful wine. You can see, you know, why with wines like that and other wines, you can see why Hardy Burgundy was as successful as it was. I mean, there were a lot of other kind of red table wines, but Gallo knew what worked, and they knew the best vineyards. And I mean, there were a lot of people who kind of, you know, they had a lot of competition in the early days, but they knew vineyards, and they worked with great old vine stands, and, you know, made, you know, one of the most successful wines in the world.
Yeah. Well, and so Jay, let's, you know, hear some of your thoughts on this Carignan, and then I'll make a couple other comments on winemaking afterwards as well.
Well, most of the Carignan that I've tasted in my life comes from Spain, from either, you know, Montsant area around Priorato. And I was fortunate enough to taste wine with Acoustic Cellars at one time. And we were tasting 100-year-old Carignan vines. And, they make them in a different style. They're more black, and but there's just, for this wine, this is really pretty wine, and it's the highest acid wine that we've had. Not that it's a high acid wine, but it's, I would say, medium plus acid on this wine. Pretty red fruit, but almost turn into blackberry on the palate. The oak is integrated on this wine and soft because it's used oak. But there's a wild herb component that comes through on this wine, more so than the rest of the wine. It's it's fresh dill and it's fresh tarragon and dried as well, coming through, that really kind of complements it. And that soil is coming through here with the sandy rockiness, with the pretty red fruit on here. So it's a little different style of Carignan than I've typically had, because I really haven't had too many. I think this is my first Lodi Carignan, so I'm happy to drink it. Again, a very delicious wine, and I think this is a good, to me, I would start with this one because of the freshness. If I was going to drink these in order, I'd probably start with this one because it is, it has a little bit lower alcohol. It's also a little bit higher in acid, really clean and fresh and easy. And good starter for me to go through the rest of these wines if I was going to pile through all 6 in a row here, which I'm not going to do right now because it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon. But right. A really great experience here, and I think it's that old vine really comes through with the purity of fruit.
Well, and Stuart, just we are over time, so we need to be brief. But do you want to comment just briefly on kind of how much Carignan, how much Grenache? You don't have to give numbers, but how common are these in Lodi?
Not as common as probably we would like. I think the old vine Carignans, there's still a number of hidden patches out there, but a lot of it has been pulled over the years, and Grenache is kind of a newer thing, and there are a few vineyards in there. So it's still, I think the Grenache is still something that's developing. And Carignan, I keep hearing of other additional old blocks, but there isn't a great deal of it still left.
Yeah. They didn't all have Bill Cheney, somebody like Bill Cheney.
And a lot of it is still, I know before when Nathan started making the mule plane, it was still being packed and shipped, I think, to Canada. So I know there's a big kind of, as you stated, one of the reasons why Carignan was planted is that it ships well. Mm-hmm. It's a hardier physical grape. I think there's still a lot that Delta Packing still works with a lot of old vine Carignan blocks that they pack and ship. So slowly but surely, as people show interest, there is Carignan coming available.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's interesting, spending time with producers in Lodi, seeing how there's volatility in wine, in the wine market. And so there's actually quite a few growers that have figured out how to kind of have multiple channels of income. And so some still actually sell and pack fruit, as Tegan was saying. Some make wine and ship it to East Coast wineries even. And then some only sell fruit locally. And then some, of course, sell fruit, but also make their own wine. So there's really an interesting range there. We are out of time for today. I hope everyone has enjoyed today's webinar. Tomorrow, we're going to talk a lot more about Lodi rules as well, which is actually the first comprehensive third-party sustainability program in the United States. It is also actually used as the basis for sustainability programs internationally and in other parts of the United States as well. And so we'll talk about that more tomorrow. We'll also talk about how white wines do in Lodi, and we'll talk about a couple of other red grape varieties that we didn't get the chance to look at today. But David, Jeff, Tegan, Stuart, any last comments that any of you would like to make?
Alphabetical? I would just love to thank you, Elaine, for allowing this presentation to occur and really hopefully have a greater understanding of our region and how it fits within the wine world. So thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
I would just add, once this COVID mess is over, we'd love to have everybody here in Lodi. I think you can get a better appreciation of these vineyards by actually walking them and looking at them. And so hopefully we can be doing that again sometime soon.
Jeff?
And yeah, Elaine, I just wanted to thank you and Tegan. I know you guys are not traditionally from Lodi, but for your continued support of the region. I think, you know, folks like you yourselves make a huge difference, especially to us. On the farming side, you get our message out there and you help us find new homes and new life, continued life for our vineyards. So just wanted to thank you.
Great, thank you. Tegan, any last comments?
No, just thank you for having me. It's really fun to kind of be involved in the Lodi scene, and you know, I think the most important thing is it's an old story, but there's a new beginning, and you know, people discovering, you know, Zinfandels is, you know, Lodi can still produce high quality, value priced wines, which, you know, a lot of the North Coast, you know, you might want to buy a Zinfandel, but you're looking, you know, at, you know, the $50 plus range, where there's still wines in Lodi that are made the exact same way that you can, you know, and I think we've seen that during COVID, that people aren't buying as expensive wines. And I think, you know, Lodi is kind of an ideal region to get high-end wines that you can drink on a regular basis. You don't have to just save them for, you know, twice a year. You can drink them weekly. And I think that is rare in the American wine world.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It's, you know, I think each of the wines we had today, like, really showcases that affordability and drinkability combo, which is so important to have in wine. And so just, you know, really a benefit for all of us. So again, thank you all for being here with us today. Actually, a big proportion of you stayed after, you know, we went a few minutes over. So thanks for staying all the way through. Again, huge thanks to Tegan, Jeff, David, and Stuart for being here to talk about your wines. Great. Thank you, Jay, for being here to comment on the wines. And we'll see you again tomorrow to comment on tomorrow's wines as well. Stuart and I will, of course, also be here tomorrow. But Tegan, David, Jeff, it was such a pleasure to get to spend today with you. So thank you for making the time.
Thank you very much.